Shalom, shalom, Israel. Welcome back as we work our way to the finish line of the so-called 613 commandments. Again, we're finding that the true number of laws is much less. And we're also learning many laws cannot be kept outside of the land and without a temple in place. We're seeing what laws there are that can be kept and how many of them are common sense laws and that they are indeed possible to keep and, most important, should not be thrown away because of mercy and grace entering into the covenant. The standards of the Most High still stand, and we should, with our greatest effort, attempt to keep them in obedience. In this video, we're focusing on the laws of impurity. Purity is important because when we talk about the righteousness of the Most High and His kingdom, we are to be a representation of Him in order to match that. When the Bible says, be made whole or perfect in His sight, it's talking about purity. So let's see some of the things that separate us from purity. Just a warning, we will be talking about some things that most men tend to be a little disgusted by, such as a woman's menstruation cycle. But we'll also be talking about men's bodily fluid issues as well. So let's get started. Law number 443, to carry out the laws of impurity of the dead. Based on Numbers 9:14, this is the law when a man dies in a tent. All that come into the tent and all that is in the tent shall be unclean 7 days. So once they determined one did come into contact with the dead and was impure, they were to carry out law number 444, the procedure of the red heifer, which was the sacrificial part that involved the priest and the temple. We see in Numbers 19, verse 2 through 5, they were to bring a red heifer without blemish that's never been used to do work, take it to the priest to be slain before him. And the priest was to take its blood and sprinkle it before the tabernacle 7 times, and the heifer was to be burned. Its ashes, along with the ashes of a cedar wood, hyssop, and wool or yarn, dyed red, were used for the ritual purification of an Israelite who came into contact with the dead. Those ashes were added to a vessel of pure water, and that water is sprinkled upon the impure person. We see this in law number 445, to carry out the laws of sprinkling water. In Numbers 19:21, the instruction is that the one who sprinkled the water on the impure person must wash himself and his clothes, and is considered unclean as well until evening. So the priest who performs this is also considered unclean by default until the evening, and he must bathe himself. So why not just have the impure Israelite who came in contact with the dead bathe himself like the priest bathed himself? Why burn a red cow to mix its ashes with pure water and then sprinkle it? We live in a microwave society today where everything is quick and easy and on to the next thing in life. But we come from a society where there were many customs and traditions ordained by the law, and each step meant something different. It was symbolic. The flawlessness of the heifer, the purity of the water, and the pure water mixed with the ashes. The water must be spring water, not rainwater. Very particular requirements. So that was impurity caused by being in contact with the dead. Now looking at impurity caused by what's called zira'at, which is conditions of disfiguration of the skin or the hair on the body or even one's clothing, and in some cases, the house they live in. There are 3 afflictions in this category, zira'at: the skin or the hair, the garment, and the house. If any affliction be found in the person or in their home or on their garment, they or it will be considered impure for 7 days, and if still unclean, another 7 days, and so on, until they are considered clean by the priest. While unclean, Leviticus 13 verse 46 says, he shall dwell alone, without the camp shall his habitation be. So again, the priest is determining this, and the impure are to be separated from his Israelite brethren. If it's his garment that is unclean, the same thing. 7 days it's given. If the priest sees that after 7 days the mold or the mildew is spread, it is to be burned. And it's safe to assume we're talking about a growth here, because dirt doesn't grow or spread over time. And purity on a garment and in homes is determined by growth. So it's safe to say we're talking about either mold or some type of residue that grows over time. If it's the house that is impure, everything in the house is removed prior to the priest coming to examine the house. If he confirms the greenish or reddish substance in the walls, it is condemned for 7 days. If the condition is the same after 7 days, the stones affected are removed and replaced with new stone. So if you're in construction, you know that this is the common sense process when you do find mold in a home, to cut it out from the home. The affected stone is removed to an unclean place outside of the city. There are further interpretations of this law. For example, townhouses built where 2 homes share a wall, and that wall is infected. Both houses are considered impure. So if the priest returns after 7 days and finds the house clean, he pronounces the house pure and no longer affected. Then he cleanses the house. So in cleansing the home, today, when we see a cleansing of a house, it's usually done by walking through the house in prayer or burning sage and walking through the house. But Leviticus 14:49 through 52 gives us insight on how the priest cleansed a house in the biblical days. It says, "And he shall take to cleanse the house 2 birds, and cedar wood, and scarlet, and hyssop. And he shall kill one of the birds in an earthen vessel over running water. And he shall take the cedar wood, and the hyssop, and the scarlet, and the living bird, and dip them in the blood of the slain bird, and in the running water, and sprinkle the house 7 times. And he shall cleanse the house with the blood of the bird, and with the running water, and with the living bird, and with the cedar wood, and with the hyssop, and with the scarlet. But he shall let go of the living bird out of the city into the open fields, and make an atonement for the house, and it shall be clean." So we're seeing a bit of sacrificial process here, where the blood of the sacrificed bird makes atonement for the condition of the home. And when we see in the passage, "he shall make an atonement for the house," it's impossible for a house to commit a sin. It's a house. And Judaism implies that the house has become a manifestation of the spiritual condition of the person living in it, and therefore it needs to be cleansed. That being said, I've seen evil people with the cleanest houses and suits and dresses. Their possessions are not a reflection of their spiritual condition. And I've seen the purest people, from my perspective, with dirty homes and garments. Pure spirit, tainted possessions. So I cannot confirm that a house is impure because of the sins of its owners. Maybe it's just a dirty house. Nonetheless, we get the gist of these laws. When a garment or home is found to be impure, it needs to be cleansed, whether that means washing or burning to get rid of, or remodeling or rebuilding. It needs to be cleansed. And of course, in today's context, there's no priest to come through with 2 birds to cleanse the house with the blood. There's no priest to declare pure and impure. And because we're scattered, there's no place to send an impure Israelite that he or she may dwell alone, away from the camp. We're living among many nations, some of us in houses we own, but many of us renting houses that are in conditions we can't control. So outside of the land and outside of a priest, we can't keep these laws, but we can see their importance. When we look at the common sense of this, of course, when a house grows mold, it needs to be fixed. Same with the garment. And looking at the skin category of zeraat in today's world, the word for leprosy in the medical sense is Hansen's disease, and it needs to be treated. So these laws are not that far-fetched to understand, but in the biblical days, we're talking about a sanctified nation within its walls, trying to be pure and untainted in every sense of the word. We need to understand how they remained a pure people. This is how, with priests delegating impurity and monitoring impurity and separating that which was impure from us. This was one of the obligations of the priests. And because the priests had these responsibilities, we see why the next few laws were given. It was against the law for an impure person to hide his or her impurity. They were commanded not to remove the signs of it or shave the signs of it. We see all through Leviticus 13 that the priest shall look, and if the priest see, over and over again. So your signs of impurity must be visible and not hidden. Law number 447, the Metzora must not remove his signs of impurity, based on Deuteronomy 24, verse 8. The Metzora is the one who's impure. Law number 448, the Metzora must not shave signs of impurity in his hair. Law number 449, the Metzora must publicize his condition by tearing his garment, allowing his hair to grow, and covering his lips. Leviticus 13, verse 45. Law 450, to carry out the prescribed rules for purifying the Metzorah. Leviticus 14:2. Law 451, the Metzorah must shave off all of his hair prior to purification. Leviticus 14:9. Law 452, to carry out the laws of Zera'at of clothing. Leviticus 13:47. Law 453, to carry out the laws of Zera'at of houses. Leviticus 13:34. And when we look at Leviticus 13, verse 33 through 36, we see why these laws can no longer be kept. It reads, "Then the priest shall command that they empty the house before the priests go in to see the plague." So the priest had to be present to determine all of this according to the law and in the land. So that's impurity of the body, of the garment, and of the home. Let's look at other impurities. Law number 454, to observe the laws of menstrual impurity, found in Leviticus 15, verse 19. And the laws are actually found in verse 19 through 30. To sum up the passage, a woman with an issue of blood, be that menstrual or excessive bleeding due to some other medical issue, she is considered unclean, and anyone who touches her is unclean until the evening of the day they touch her. Understand, there are things that are not sinful which make us unclean. The menstrual cycle is one of them. It says in Leviticus 15, verse 20, everything a woman sits on or lies on, if she be on her cycle or has an issue of blood, she makes unclean. The law says whatever we sit on becomes unclean. So for me, this means you might want to buy one of those big plush pillows and sit on the floor. You don't have to announce that it's that time of the month. Just make provisions for yourself. That's what I would do in keeping this law, because I love big plush pillows. But if a pillow is too low to the floor, you can sit in a fold-out chair or any other movable type seat. The key is anything unclean must be washed. It says whoever touches the bed she lies in is also considered unclean until the evening, so they have to bathe and wash their clothes. Now, scripturally speaking, verse 25 says this 7-day period is considered a time of separation. Verse 26 implies there is a separate bed she should sleep in, considered her bed of separation. So it sounds like there is a separate place the woman should sleep during this time. And I know that sounds inconvenient, but that's what the law says. And if there's a separate bed, there should be a separate chair to sit on as well, instead of the couch you would normally sit on. So if your wife is on her period, most husbands still lie with her in bed in today's world. But according to the law, that bed is unclean. Your clothes are unclean, and you are considered unclean until that evening, and you must bathe. I can imagine most husbands don't have a problem being considered unclean because they intend to wash their clothes after the day and take a shower anyway. Besides, she's considered unclean for a week, and she has no choice in the matter, so most husbands just know and understand that while she's unclean for that week, you too will be unclean if you're lying with her. And I'm talking about just lying next to her in bed. If you're having sexual relations with her, verse 24 says, you're not just unclean until the evening, you're unclean for 7 days. So if her discharge touches you, her flowers, the Bible calls it, I don't know why it calls it that, but if her flowers touch you, you are unclean for 7 days. Okay, so the command is not to touch your wife or lay with her during her issue. The command is informing you that if you do so, you will be considered unclean until the evening. So the two of you will be unclean together, basically. So the command is, if you become unclean, to wash the clothing and to bathe yourself. Verse 28 says, once her time of the month ends, she still must wait 7 days to be considered ceremonially clean. So there's a difference between clean and ceremonially clean. She's clean once her issue passes, but not ceremonially clean enough to participate in ceremonies until another 7 days passes. So 7 days unclean while it's on, and 7 more days ceremonially unclean only. Your husband can touch you after 7 days, but if we were back in the land with the temple in place, you're not clean enough to be near it for yet and still another 7 days. Can this law be kept? Absolutely. Obviously, the ceremony part of this law is irrelevant outside of the temple, but the rest applies. But men, please know that this law pertains to you as well. Men have running issues too. And we'll get to that in a little bit. So aside from the ceremonial uncleanliness that's irrelevant outside of the temple, the other part of this law that we cannot keep today is after the woman becomes clean. Verse 29 says she was to take 2 doves or 2 young pigeons and bring them to the priest, who then sacrificed one for a sin offering and the other for a burnt offering. He was making atonement for her for the uncleanness of her discharge. We see atonement being done for sin a lot, but this time, atonement is about oneness. No sin committed, just bringing us back to oneness with the Most High's expectation of purity. Now, looking at other natural occurrences that yet and still are considered impure, childbirth. Law number 455, observe the laws of impurity caused by childbirth. Leviticus 12, verse 2. Again, not caused by sin, but an impurity nonetheless. Leviticus 12:2 says, speak unto the children of Israel, saying, if a woman have conceived seed and born a male child, then she shall be unclean 7 days. According to the days of the separation for her infirmity shall she be unclean. Verse 4 says, after her boy child is circumcised on the 8th day, she must then wait 33 days to be clean from her bleeding. She must not touch anything sacred or go to the sanctuary until the days of her purification are over. So what if she gives birth to a baby girl? Verse 5 says she will be unclean for 2 weeks, and then she must wait 66 days to be purified from her bleeding. So 8 days, then 33 more days waiting after the circumcision of a male baby, and 2 weeks, then 66 more days waiting after the birth of a girl baby. And again, she is to take 2 doves or 2 young pigeons, one for a burnt offering and the other for a sin offering, to the priest for him to make atonement for her impurity. And this is the portion of the law that can no longer be kept today. But we can still observe the timeline of impurity after childbirth. So remember I said it could be her menstrual period or some other health issue. So this law is covering other running issues outside of the period. And for men, Law 457, observe the laws of impurity caused by a man's running issue. Yes, men have running issues too. That can cause them to be separated. Leviticus 15, verse 2 through 3. When any man has an unusual bodily discharge, such a discharge is unclean. Whether it continues flowing from his body or is blocked, it will make him unclean. This is how his discharge will bring about uncleanness. It goes on to say his bed where he lies is unclean, and anywhere he sits is unclean. Anyone who touches his bed must wash their clothes and bathe with water, and they will be unclean until the evening. Whoever sits on anything that the man with a discharge sat on must wash their clothes and bathe with water, and they will be unclean until the evening. So this is the point where he would be the one sitting on that fold-out chair or on the floor. Verse 12, even a clay pot he touches, talking about the work he puts his hands to. If he touches it, it must be broken. And any wooden article is to be rinsed with water. On day 8, he takes the 2 doves and the 2 young pigeons to the priest for atonement. Again, part of this law that cannot be kept. We've looked at impurity caused by contact with the dead, impurity caused by menstruation or running issues of both men and women. Now let's look at other sources of impurity. Law number 458, to observe the laws of impurity caused by a dead beast. Leviticus 11:39, if any beast of which ye may eat die, he that touches the carcass of the beast is unclean until the evening. So if you remember way back in law number 188, not to eat the meat of an animal that died without ritual slaughter. So this new law here is reiterating that law. It says we can't touch the carcass of the beast. Law number 459, to observe the laws of impurity caused by the 8 shratzim, crawling creatures. Another reiteration, we saw this commandment in law number 184, not to eat non-kosher creatures that crawl on land. This new law is telling us impurity is the end result. Law number 460, observe the laws of impurity of a seminal emission. What's that? Semen. Leviticus 15, verse 16, when a man has an emission of semen, he must bathe his whole body with water, and he will be unclean until the evening. It goes on to say in verse 17, any clothing or leather that has semen on it must be washed with water, and it will be unclean until the evening. When a man has sexual relations with a woman and there is an emission of semen, both of them must bathe with water, and they will be unclean until the evening. So, who knew that sexual relations between a husband and a wife would lead to impurity until the evening? I didn't, until now. We're learning together in Israel the laws of impurity. Our final two laws are on the impurity of food. Law number 461, to observe the laws of impurity concerning liquid and solid foods. Leviticus 11:34, any food you are allowed to eat that has come into contact with water from any such pot is unclean, and any liquid that is drunk from such pot is unclean. So food that has come into contact with water from an impure pot is impure food. Law 462, every impure person must immerse themselves in a mikveh to become pure, based on Leviticus 15:16. Outside of the temple, a mikveh is simply considered a bath. We reviewed 462 laws today, 19 of which need to be omitted because they were repeats or false additions, 40 laws that need to be changed to fit their scriptural reference, and 222 laws that can no longer be kept today. So although we've studied 462 laws, only 443 of them are true laws. And of these true laws, only 221 can be observed today by scattered Israel, outside of the temple laws and outside of the priestly laws. Not as intimidating as you originally thought. And again, many of these laws are common sense laws, easy to keep if you're willing to try. So I want to thank you guys for joining me once again. Until next time, this is Judiah. Shalom.